There comes a moment in every woman's life when the weight she has been carrying quietly, gracefully, endlessly, suddenly feels heavier than her own bones can sustain. And in that moment, something inside her cracks, not violently, not loudly, but with a soft internal shattering that only she can hear, a sound that echoes through the years of overgiving, shrinking, pleasing, hoping, performing, and surviving. And as that crack opens, something unexpected rises from within the faint voice. She abandoned long ago the self she left behind to be loved, acceptable, chosen, safe. And for the first time in years, she feels the tremble of truth beneath her ribs, a truth she has avoided because she knew that once she heard it, she could never return to the woman she pretended to be. And as she stands at the threshold of her own becoming, she realizes that life has not betrayed her. It has been preparing her, stripping away every illusion she clung to so she could finally meet herself without disguise, without apology, without the persona she constructed to survive in a world that rewarded her silence more than her truth. And in this quiet but seismic moment, she discovers that her awakening does not begin when she becomes stronger, but when she becomes honest about her needs, her wounds, her desires, her exhaustion, her longing, her anger, her intuition, her heartbreak, her worth. And as she exhales, releasing the weight of who she thought she had to be, she steps into the beginning of a journey she has unknowingly been walking toward her entire life, the journey back to herself. The quiet breaking of a woman. Every woman has a moment. She never forgets a moment when something inside her gives way at last. Not because she is weak, but because she has been strong for far too long, in ways that no one saw, not even herself. And it often happens in the smallest, most unremarkable instant, driving home after holding everything together yet again, or standing in the shower where the water hides her shaking, or lying awake while the person she gave everything to sleeps peacefully beside her, unaware of the storms she swallows instead of speaking. And in this moment, she feels a collapse that is not physical, but psychological, the shattering of an inner scaffolding she built from compliance, self-abandonment, impossible expectations, and the belief that if she just gives a little more, tries a little harder, quiets herself a little longer, she will finally earn the love, safety, or recognition she has been longing for. But the collapse reveals a truth she has avoided. She has been disappearing inside others, shrinking to fit relationships, dimming to keep peace, softening to avoid being too much, hardening to survive, being too little. And as this realization hits her with unbearable clarity, she wants to run from it, because it threatens everything: her identity, her illusions, her relationships, her history. But the crack in her heart widens and becomes a doorway she cannot close, and through it, she sees the woman she has been sacrificing, the one who once dreamed, boldly felt, deeply spoke, honestly loved, fearlessly. The one who stopped asking for what she needed because she learned early that needing too much made her unlovable. And as she stares at this forgotten self, grief rises like a tide, grief for every version of her that went silent so someone else could stay comfortable, grief for the years she spent carrying emotional loads that were never hers, grief for the times she mistook self-sacrifice for intimacy, grief for the girl inside her who kept stretching herself thin, hoping someone would notice. And while this grief feels heavy beneath it, something ancient begins to stir, a knowing she cannot push down anymore, that the life she has been living is too small for the woman she is becoming, that her heart is tired, not because she is unworthy, but because she has been investing her worth in places incapable of holding it. And as this knowing spreads through her like fire, she feels a mixture of terror and relief. Terror because she knows change is coming. Relief because she has been waiting her entire life for this moment without realizing it. And with trembling hands, she touches the edges of her own truth, afraid it might burn her, but discovering instead that it warms her, strengthens her, calls her forward with a voice that sounds like her own. And in that instant, she understands something she has never dared to believe. She is not breaking down. She is breaking open. She is not losing herself. She is meeting herself for the first time. And although she does not yet know where this journey will take her, she knows she can no longer return to the woman she was before, because the moment a woman hears her own truth, she can never unhear it. The echo of her abandoned self. There comes a night after the quiet breaking when she lies awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling a restlessness she cannot soothe, a trembling under her skin that does not come from fear, but from recognition, because something inside her has begun to move softly at first, like the whisper of a woman she once was calling to her. Through the years, she ignored herself, and she realizes that what she feels is not anxiety, but memory. The memory of a self she left behind in her attempts to be enough for others, a self who never stopped waiting for her. A self who survived in the margins of her life, watching patiently as she poured herself into people and places incapable of holding her. And as she listens to this echo, she feels an ache rise in her chest, a longing so deep it frightens her because she knows it is not longing for another person. It is longing for herself, longing for the girl she abandoned in order to be chosen, longing for the dreams she buried under obligations, longing for the intuition she silenced to keep peace, longing for the desires she hid because they made others uncomfortable, longing for the woman she could have become if she had not believed that love required her disappearance. And as she allows herself to feel this longing, a wave of grief washes over her grief, for all the times she apologized for her emotions, for all the times she stayed quiet when her soul was screaming for every moment. She made herself small to protect someone else's fragility, for every red flag she rationalized, for every gut instinct she dismissed, for every boundary she softened to avoid being abandoned, for every part of her that learned to survive by disappearing. And beneath this grief comes a revelation that pierces her heart. With truth, she was never abandoned by others as deeply as she abandoned herself, not out of weakness but out of conditioning, because the world taught her early that being agreeable was safer than being honest, that being needed was more valuable than being known, that being loyal was more important than being fulfilled. And she internalized these lessons until they became the blueprint for her relationships, the rhythm of her self-worth, the architecture of her identity. But now, as she lies awake, hearing the echo of her abandoned self, she realizes that the woman she left behind is not angry with her. She is patient. She is wise. She is powerful. And she is calling her back. Not with blame, but with truth. And this truth arrives gently but firmly. You do not have to disappear anymore. It tells her, you do not have to earn your belonging. You do not have to trade pieces of yourself for scraps of affection. You do not have to keep choosing people who would never choose you if you stopped breaking yourself to be easy for them. And as these words fill her, she feels something loosening inside a knot she carried for years, beginning to unravel. And in that unraveling, she sees the patterns she once believed were fate, but were actually wounds. Wounds that turned into habits. Habits that disguised themselves as love. And she whispers to herself through tears, I'm sorry, not because she failed, but because she finally understands how deeply she abandoned her own heart in order to protect someone else's comfort. And in this apology, she feels a shift, a softening, a returning. Because the moment a woman apologizes to the part of herself she abandoned is the moment she begins to heal. And healing does not begin with confidence or clarity. Healing begins with recognition, with the courage to look at the life she has built and admit which parts were built. From fear, from loneliness, from longing, from silence, from the belief that she was too much or not enough. And as she admits this, she feels the presence of her true self grow stronger. No longer an echo, but a quiet companion sitting beside her in the dark, reminding her that she has never truly been alone. That despite everything she did to adapt, to survive, to endure, she never lost the essence of who she is. She only forgot how to listen to her. And now, as she closes her eyes, she imagines the woman she abandoned standing before her, not as a ghost, but as a mirror, showing her the parts she buried, the fire in her voice, the clarity in her intuition, the boundaries she deserved, the desires she suppressed, the softness she protected, the strength she diminished, and she realizes that this forgotten woman is not a past version. She must grieve. She is a future self. She is finally ready to revisit a self who has been waiting at the threshold of her consciousness, whispering, come back to me, not because you failed without me, but because you are finally ready to become who you were before the world taught you to disappear. And with that realization, she feels her breath deepen, her chest expand, her heart awaken with a kind of quiet electricity that feels both foreign and deeply familiar. And she understands that this journey is not about reinventing herself, but remembering herself, re-entering her own life, reclaiming the part she left behind along the path of trying to be loved. And though she still feels fear rising like a tide, she also feels something stronger beneath it, a steady pulse of self-recognition. The beginning of a relationship she should have never abandoned, the relationship with herself. And as she wipes her tears, She whispers one more apology, not in shame, but in reverence. "I'm here now," she says, "I won't leave you again." And in that promise, the echo of her abandoned self becomes the heartbeat of her awakening, the fire of worthiness. There comes a point in every woman's awakening when the grief of self-abandonment begins to transform into something far more powerful, a heat rising slowly from within her chest, a burning that is not anger in the way she has been taught to fear it, but purification, the fire of worthiness, reclaiming space inside her body. And at first, this fire frightens her because she has spent years learning to suppress any flame that threatened to disturb the peace around her, any spark that hinted she deserved more than what she was given, any heat that suggested she was not meant to settle for emotional crumbs. And so when this fire begins to rise, she tries instinctively to smother it with old habits, rationalizing mistreatment, numbing herself with overwork or overthinking, retreating into the persona of the understanding woman, the one who absorbs everyone else's burdens but carries her own in silence. Yet this time, the fire refuses to extinguish because it is not coming from pain alone, but from truth. The truth that she deserved more all along, that she was worthy, long before anyone recognized it, that her needs were not excessive, that her emotions were not flaws, that her intuition was not irrational, that her presence was not negotiable. And as this truth burns through her, it begins melting away the layers of conditioning that convinced her otherwise, revealing the roots of the beliefs that once kept her small beliefs inherited from childhood, from culture, from relationships where her worth was measured by how little she demanded, how much she tolerated, how deeply she swallowed her disappointment. And now that she sees these beliefs clearly, she feels a mixture of rage and clarity. Rage at the way she was taught to distrust herself. Clarity in realizing she no longer has to carry those teachings forward. And in this moment, she does not yet feel strong, but she feels awake. Awake in a way that makes it impossible to return to sleepwalking through her life. Awake in a way that makes settling unbearable, awake in a way that makes self-abandonment impossible to justify. Because once a woman touches her worthiness, even for a moment, her entire life begins to rearrange around that truth. And this rearrangement begins internally before it ever shows up, externally starting with small but monumental shifts. Her breath deepens, her posture changes, her voice steadies, her preferences become clearer. Her tolerance for emotional inconsistency shrinks, her ability to sense misalignment sharpens, her heart begins to refuse what her mind once negotiated. And while this fire of worthiness feels new, it also feels ancient, as if generations of women live within her ribcage whispering, "Enough. No more shrinking, no more silence. No more choosing people who cannot meet you." And though this ancestral echo is fierce, it is not violent, it is protective, guiding her back to herself with a flame that illuminates everything she once hid from, including the people she kept giving chances to, the wounds she kept excusing, the patterns she kept repeating. And as the light of this fire touches these parts of her life, she sees with piercing clarity that many of the relationships she fought to maintain were built not on love, but on fear. The fear of being alone, the fear of being too much, the fear of not being enough, the fear of starting over, the fear of facing herself. And she realizes with a pang of sadness that some people were not meant to stay past the version of her who needed them, that some connections can only survive when she is small, that some lovers were only compatible with her silence, not her truth. And though this realization hurts, the fire within her grows even warmer, telling her softly that she no longer has to beg to be understood, no longer has to prove she is worthy of the love she gives so easily, no longer has to perform emotional labor that drains her spirit, because worthiness is not something she earns, it is something she remembers, something she embodies, something she returns to when she stops outsourcing her sense of value to people who benefit from her forgetting it. And as she sits with this flame burning brighter in her chest, she feels her shadow rising, not as an enemy, but as an ally, showing her the parts of herself she suppressed to stay lovable. The anger she feared would make her unkind, the desire she feared would make her selfish, the intuition she feared would make her irrational, the boundaries she feared would make her unlikable. And she realizes that these parts were never dangerous, they were necessary, and without them she was incomplete. And now, as she reaches toward these shadow aspects with trembling hands, they do not lash out or resist. They lean forward, relieved to finally be acknowledged, because the shadow does not exist to punish her, but to remind her of everything she lost when she made herself small, And as she integrates these pieces, her fire, her boundaries, her intuition, her desires, she begins to recognize herself not as a woman who needs saving, but as a woman who is reclaiming the throne inside her own heart. The throne she abandoned when she believed that love required her to sit on the floor, and with this reclamation comes a shift so deep, it echoes through her entire being. She no longer asks, "Am I worthy?" but instead asks, "Does this honor my worth?" And with that single shift, everything changes. Not because she forces anything, but because she now carries herself differently, speaks differently, chooses differently, breathes differently. And the world responds to her differently because she radiates a self-respect that requires no explanation, no justification, no negotiation. And though she is still in the early stages of her awakening, she feels ready for the next truth. The one, the fire of worthiness, always reveals the truth that her loneliness was never a punishment. It was a doorway, a threshold she was always meant to cross, because only in solitude can she hear the voice. She once silenced the voice that whispers, "You were never broken. You were only dimmed." And as she steps toward this loneliness with new eyes ready to meet what she once feared, she feels the fire inside her guide her gently into the next chapter of her becoming. Loneliness as initiation. There comes a moment in a woman's awakening when the fire of worthiness does not lead her into triumph or clarity, but into an unexpected and unsettling landscape. Loneliness, a vast and echoing inner desert. She once feared more than heartbreak, more than rejection, more than truth. And as she enters this emotional wilderness, she feels the instinct to run back toward the familiar, toward the people who drained her, the patterns that suffocated her, the relationships where she disappeared, because even the wounds she knows feel safer than the emptiness. She does not yet. Something inside her holds her still, something wiser than her fear whispering, "Stay." And for the first time, she considers that loneliness might not be a punishment, but a passage. Not abandonment, but initiation. A sacred descent into the parts of herself she avoided in the noise of constantly tending to others. And at first, the silence feels unbearable, without distractions, without roles to play. Without someone else's needs to outrun her own, she becomes aware of every ache she has swallowed, every truth she has buried, every longing she has silenced. And this sudden confrontation with herself feels like standing in front of a mirror. She has spent her entire life avoiding a mirror that reflects not just the woman she is, but the woman she could have become had she never abandoned her own heart. And she trembles at the sight because she is not yet sure she deserves to meet that version of herself. But solitude insists, gently, persistently, lovingly. Look, and as she looks deeper, the loneliness begins to shift, not by disappearing, but by revealing its true shape. And she realizes with a slow, breathtaking clarity that she is not actually alone. She is simply without distractions for the first time in her life. And what she mistook for emptiness is actually space. She has never allowed herself to occupy space where her intuition, her desires, her dreams, her boundaries, her forgotten joys begin to reemerge one by one like figures stepping out of fog. And she feels her heart tighten because she recognizes these parts intimately. Like old friends she lost in the chaos of overgiving. And they greet her not with resentment, but with relief, as if they have been waiting years for her to stop abandoning herself long enough to hear them. And in this profound stillness, she begins to understand that the real fear she carried was not the fear of loneliness, but the fear of meeting who she truly is when no one else's voice is louder than her own. And now that she is here standing in this raw inner landscape, she finally hears her own voice, clearly, a sound both soft and fierce. A sound that reminds her of forgotten truths, that she has survived every moment she thought would break her, that she has carried herself further than she gives herself credit for, that she has never needed to earn the love she deserves, that her softness is strength. Her intuition is wisdom, her longing is guidance, her boundaries are sacred. And as she listens to these truths, the loneliness begins to feel less like a void and more like a womb, the birthplace of her next self. The chrysalis, where the version of her she has outgrown dissolves so the woman she is becoming can take form. And though this transformation is invisible on the outside, it is monumental within her psyche, because for the first time, she is not defining herself through the eyes of others, she is meeting herself from the inside out. And this is the initiation every woman must undergo on the path to sovereignty. The descent into the unconscious, where she excavates the pieces of her she once abandoned and brings them home. Not as fragments, but as parts of a whole. And as the days pass, she notices subtle changes. Her breath deepens her intuition, sharpens her need for external reassurance, softens her emotional landscape, becomes clearer, and she begins to understand that solitude is not the absence of love, but the presence of self. And within this presence, she discovers a truth she had been too frightened to face. She has been lonely for years, even in relationships, even surrounded by people, even when she gave everything she had because she abandoned herself in exchange for connection. And no amount of love from others can fill the void created when a woman abandons her own essence. And when she realizes this, the loneliness she feels now begins to transform into something sacred, a reclaiming, a recalibration, a reorienting toward her own center. And the more she sits with this loneliness, the more she begins to feel her own energy return, drip by drip, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. And she senses that the universe did not place her here to punish her, but to free her. Free her from the illusions she clung to. Free her from the patterns she repeated, free her from the expectations that suffocated her, free her from the roles that distorted her joy. Free her from the relationships that fed on her silence. And as this realization spreads through her, she begins to feel a new kind of strength, a strength that does not roar but hums beneath her ribs, steady, ancient feminine, a strength that tells her, you are not fragile. You are becoming, and in becoming, she understands the deeper Jungian truth of this initiation. The descent into loneliness is the descent into the shadow. The place where the feminine encounters her hidden power. The rage she was told was unacceptable. The desire she was told was selfish. The intuition she was told was irrational. The boundaries she was told were unkind. And as she touches these shadow aspects, they do not frighten her. They ignite her, reminding her that wholeness requires the reclamation of everything she once rejected in herself. And loneliness, now transformed into initiation, becomes the temple where she meets these parts, not with shame, but with reverence. And in this sacred meeting, she begins the slow and powerful process of integration, the weaving of her light and her shadow into a single coherent self. And though she does not yet know what this integration will make her become, she feels for the first time in her life a quiet joy in not knowing, because not knowing means she is finally free from the old script, free from the expectations, free from the roles that once confined her. And with this freedom, she steps deeper into the wilderness of herself, not afraid, but awakened, ready for the next truth. Her journey will reveal that the woman she must become cannot emerge until the woman she pretended to be finally dissolves. Removing the mask of the good woman, there comes a moment in every woman's inner awakening when she begins to sense that the loneliness she feared was never the real prison. The true confinement was the mask she wore for years, the mask of the good woman. The one who smiles even when she is breaking, the one who nurtures even when she is empty, the one who forgives what should not be forgiven, the one who makes herself smaller so others can feel bigger, the one who swallows her truth to keep the peace, the one who believes that being agreeable is safer than being authentic. And as she becomes more aware of this mask, she begins to feel a subtle suffocation. She cannot ignore a tightness around her chest, as if every breath she takes must pass through layers of expectations she never agreed to carry. And the more she looks at this mask, the more she realizes it was not created by her soul, but constructed by survival, formed in childhood when she learned that affection came when she behaved withheld, when she expressed need, formed in relationships where her softness was exploited, formed in a culture that praises women for being quiet, kind, compliant, selfless to the point of erasure. And as she examines this mask, something fierce rises inside her, something that does not want to be polite or subtle or pleasing, something that has been asleep but not dead, something that whispers, "This is not who you are." And with each whisper, the mask begins to crack, revealing glimpses of the woman she might have been had she not learned to prioritize harmony over her own truth. And as she touches these cracks, she feels years of suppressed emotion swell in her chest. Not just sadness, but rage, a sacred righteous rage at the way she has betrayed her own boundaries at the times. She apologized for wanting more at the relationships where she carried all the emotional weight, at the situations where she pretended to be okay to avoid being labeled difficult, dramatic, demanding. And for a moment, she feels shame for this rage because she was taught to associate anger with danger, with loss of love, with being unworthy. But as she breathes deeper, she realizes this rage is not destructive. It is clarifying, illuminating, revealing every place where she abandoned herself to maintain the illusion of being good. And in this illumination, she experiences the first true taste of freedom, not because she has removed the mask yet, but because she finally sees it for what it is, a persona, an identity. She performed not because it reflected her truth, but because it protected her from rejection. And once she sees the mask, she cannot unsee it. And a woman who sees her own mask is already halfway free. And so she begins the slow, often painful unmasking, peeling away layers of conditioning that cling to her skin like old wallpaper, peeling away beliefs that once held her together but now hold her hostage, peeling away the habits that kept her liked but never loved, peeling away the fear that made her choose safety over authenticity. And the more she removes, the more exposed she feels, raw, unfamiliar to herself, standing between the woman she was told to be and the woman she has never allowed herself to become. And in this vulnerable in-between, she feels tempted to reach for the mask again, because unmasking feels dangerous, unprotected, unpredictable. But she resists because something inside her knows that if she puts the mask back on now, she may never find the courage to take it off again, and so she lets herself unravel, lets herself feel the weight of every yes she gave when her heart was screaming no. The weight of every time she accepted crumbs while offering feasts. The weight of every time she silenced her intuition to avoid upsetting someone else's inadequacy. And as she feels this weight, she realizes something profound. The mask preserved the relationship she had, but prevented the relationship she needed. And those who loved the masked version of her loved an illusion, not her. And those who failed to meet her needs did so because her mask taught them she had none. And this truth stings, but liberates her, because now she understands that unmasking will not lose her real love. It will reveal it, and it will filter out the connections that only existed because she consented to her own self-erasure. And so she begins reclaiming the pieces of herself. The mask once demanded she hide her voice. Once softened to avoid conflict, now rising with clarity. Her desires, once buried under obligation, now resurfacing like embers. Her boundaries, once negotiable, now becoming sacred. Her intuition, once dismissed as irrational, now becoming her compass. Her emotional depth, once shamed as too much, now becoming her greatest source of truth. And with each piece reclaimed, she feels more herself. Not the curated version she presented to the world, but the unfiltered, unedited, unperformed self she buried to survive. And she discovers that authenticity does not make her unlovable, it makes her unforgettable, and boundaries do not make her difficult. They make her dignified, and expressing her needs does not make her needy. It makes her human, and her fire does not make her dangerous. It makes her alive. And as she stands in this powerful reclamation, she experiences a transformation she never anticipated removing. The mask does not just change the way she sees herself. It changes the way the world sees her, because people respond to her new self-respect with either admiration or intimidation, clarity or discomfort, love or withdrawal. And she realizes this is not a loss, but a sorting, a filtering of her life into what is aligned and what is not. And the more she removes the mask, the less she fears the sorting, because she is no longer trying to hold together a life built on performance. She is creating a life built on truth. And as the mask finally falls away, she does not feel exposed, she feels liberated, and she knows with absolute certainty that the woman emerging from beneath the ruins of the good woman persona is the woman she was always meant to become. And though this woman is still learning, still healing, still integrating, she carries something the masked version never had: a sense of self that does not depend on anyone else's comfort, approval, or permission. And with this new foundation, she steps forward, ready for the next stage of her awakening, the rise of the shadow feminine. The part of her she feared most, and the part that will ultimately free her completely. The shadow feminine, the woman she buried. There comes a stage in a woman's awakening when removing the mask is no longer enough, because beneath the mask lies something far older, far deeper, far more powerful than she expected. Her shadow feminine, the version of herself she exiled long before she even understood the cost of that exile. The part of her that holds everything she was taught to suppress: her instincts, her boundaries, her anger, her desire, her knowing, her magnetism, her truth, her wildness, her voice, her refusal to settle, her unapologetic self. And when this shadow rises, it does not arrive gently. The way her loneliness did, it arrives like a pulse, like a knock on a locked door that has waited decades to be opened. And at first, she resists it, because she has been conditioned her entire life to believe that this part of her is dangerous, too much, unlovable, unacceptable. The part that ruins relationships, the part that scares people, the part that makes her difficult, the part that refuses to abandon herself for the comfort of others. And so when she feels this shadow stirring inside her chest, she panics, trying to shove it back down with the old language she used for years. I shouldn't feel this. I don't want to upset anyone. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I'm imagining things. I need to be patient. I shouldn't be angry. I should be more understanding. But this time, the shadow does not shrink, because she is no longer the woman who can pretend she does not know the truth. And the truth is that her shadow feminine was never the enemy. She was the protector, the guardian, the part that stepped forward every time someone disrespected her boundaries, betrayed her trust, dismissed her emotions, took advantage of her softness. But because she was taught that feminine acceptance is more important than feminine authenticity, she forced her shadow to retreat into silence. And now, as this shadow rises, she realizes with breathtaking clarity that every moment she felt resentment, exhaustion, or instinctive discomfort was not weakness. It was her shadow trying to save her, and she ignored it because she was taught to be agreeable instead of honest, pleasant instead of powerful, forgiving instead of discerning. And now she feels the weight of all the times she silenced this part of herself, the times she said yes when everything inside her screamed no, the times she stayed when her intuition begged her to leave, the times she softened her voice to avoid making someone else uncomfortable, the times she carried emotional burdens that were never hers to hold. And this realization hits her so deeply that she feels a wave of grief followed by a wave of fury, a sacred fury that rises not to harm her, but to honor her, the kind of fury that awakens the part of her that refuses to be mistreated, again refuses to be overlooked again, refuses to betray herself again. And as she feels this fury, she finally understands that feminine anger is not chaotic, it is directional. It is the compass that points to where something has been violated, denied, suppressed, or ignored. And the more she listens to this shadow, the more she begins to hear what it has been trying to tell her for years. You were not wrong for wanting more. Your intuition was right. The first time your boundaries mattered even when others didn't respect them. Your softness deserved protection. Your silence was never owed. Your needs were valid. Your desires were not too much. And as she takes in these truths, she realizes she has been living a fractured existence, showing the world the parts of herself that felt acceptable while burying the parts that were essential for her wholeness. And this fragmentation created patterns she thought were fate. Choosing partners who underestimated her because she underestimated herself, choosing friendships that drained her because she was addicted to overgiving, tolerating emotional inconsistency because she did not trust her own worth, confusing peace with emotional numbness because she had forgotten what her true self felt like. But now, as her shadow rises, these patterns unravel like threads. She can no longer pretend are woven into anything real, and she stands in the rawness of this unraveling knowing. She has a choice. She can try to force herself back into the version of her that once survived but never thrived, or she can let the shadow feminine lead her into the darkest parts of herself. The places where her wounds, her desires, her intuition, and her truth have been waiting patiently for her return. And though she is afraid, she chooses the descent, because something in her knows the darkness is not where she loses herself, it is where she finds herself. And so she steps inward, and in this inward journey, she meets the parts. She abandoned the girl who was shamed for being emotional, the woman who was punished for speaking up, the feminine self who was told her desires were excessive, the intuitive self who was mocked for knowing things she shouldn't know, the fierce self who was labeled dramatic for refusing to tolerate disrespect. And as these fragments appear before her, she sees that they are not jagged but shining, not broken but waiting, not dangerous but essential. And she gathers them with a tenderness she has never given herself, realizing that every part of her she was taught to hide was a doorway into her power. And as she gathers these pieces, she feels herself becoming heavier, not weighed down, but grounded, not overwhelmed, but embodied. And this embodiment is unlike anything she has ever felt. It is the feeling of coming back into her own skin, reclaiming her space, her breath, her voice, her truth. her anger, her softness, her intuition, her desire, her boundaries. And this reclamation feels like standing barefoot on sacred earth, feeling the pulse of generations of women beneath her, all whispering the same thing. Do not fear your shadow. Fear the life you lived without it, and with this ancestral echo in her body, she begins integrating her shadow, not as something separate, but as something central. And in this integration, she discovers an entirely new kind of power, a power that does not seek permission, a power that does not apologize for existing, a power that sees through pretense, a power that knows when to walk away, a power that is tender enough to love deeply, but strong enough not to lose herself in the process. And as this power fills her chest, she feels the axis of her life begin to shift, because once a woman integrates her shadow, she becomes unmanipulable, uninterested in half-love, intolerant of emotional crumbs, incapable of shrinking to fit the smallness of others. And as she rises with this integrated self, she realizes she is no longer afraid of being too much. She is afraid of ever being too little. Again, afraid of ever abandoning herself. Again, afraid of ever betraying her truth for the illusion of safety. And with this clarity, she steps forward into the next phase of her becoming, the reclamation of emotional sovereignty, the stage where the opinions, behaviors, and validation of others no longer define her, but simply orbit around the center she has rebuilt within herself. And as she crosses this threshold, she feels the shadow feminine walk beside her, not behind her, not in front of her, but beside her as an equal, as a guide, as a part of her she will never exile again. The day she stops seeking permission to feel. There comes a turning point in every woman's awakening when reclaiming her shadow is no longer the final step. It is the beginning of something deeper, something that shifts the foundation of her entire emotional world. Because once she meets the parts of herself she was taught to fear, she begins to realize how much of her life has been shaped not by truth, but by emotional dependency. The dependency on being understood to feel valid, the dependency on being chosen to feel worthy, the dependency on being reassured to feel safe, the dependency on being seen to feel real. And she has carried these dependencies for so long that they feel like personality traits rather than survival patterns. But now, with her shadow beside her and her intuition awakened, she begins to feel an unfamiliar strength rising through her body, a strength that does not come from being loved by others, but from finally loving herself enough to stop outsourcing her emotional stability. And at first, this shift feels disorienting, like stepping off a ship. She lived on her whole life and touching solid ground for the first time, not quite trusting her own balance, yet knowing she can no longer return to the rocking waves of emotional reliance. And as she stands on this new internal ground, she realizes something profound. Emotional sovereignty is not the absence of emotion. It is the absence of self-betrayal, the absence of abandoning herself whenever someone else fails to meet her needs, the absence of collapsing whenever someone withdraws affection, the absence of shrinking whenever someone misunderstands her, the absence of molding herself to earn connection. And she begins to see with piercing clarity how often she allowed her emotional state to be dictated by the behaviors, moods, or inconsistencies of others. How often she gave away her inner power by assuming that her peace was something external. People had the right to influence, and this realization stings, not because she blames herself, but because she finally understands the depth of her own innocence, the innocence of a woman who learned to equate emotional attunement with emotional dependence, who believed that love meant merging, sacrificing, absorbing, losing herself. And now, as this innocence melts into awareness, she feels the first pulse of sovereignty, a quiet pulse that whispers, "You do not need anyone to validate what you feel." And with that whisper, her inner world begins to rearrange in subtle but powerful ways. She no longer rushes to explain herself, no longer begs to be understood, no longer anxiously interprets silence as rejection, no longer interprets someone else's emotional distance as evidence of her inadequacy, no longer clings to relationships where she is the only one doing the emotional labor. And she begins realizing that her emotions are not liabilities. They are information, guidance, inner truth. And the moment she stops judging them through the lens of others' reactions is the moment she begins hearing herself clearly for the first time. And as she listens, she hears truths she once buried under compromise. She hears her exhaustion, her longing, her intuition, her resentment, her desire for reciprocity, her need for depth, her hunger for true connection. And these truths no longer overwhelm her. They orient her. Like constellations she can finally navigate by, and the more she listens, the more she realizes that emotional sovereignty is not about independence, it's about alignment. The alignment of her inner world with her outer choices. And this alignment begins to show up in her life through decisions she once lacked the courage to make. She stops over-explaining to people who aren't listening, stops softening her boundaries to maintain fragile relationships, stops dimming her emotions to keep others comfortable, stops tolerating inconsistency, stops waiting for someone to treat her the way she treats them, stops giving unlimited understanding to people who offer her none, stops participating in conversations that drain her spirit, stops chasing closure from people who never gave her clarity, stops seeking reassurance from those who benefit from her insecurity, and in doing so, she discovers a new kind of peace, a peace that does not depend on others behaving correctly but on her no longer betraying herself. And this peace is unlike anything she has ever felt. Grounded, quiet, embodied hers, and yet it requires something she once feared deeply, grieving the parts of her that tied love to self-sacrifice, grieving the fantasy that someone else would one day show up and make her feel the safety she never learned to give herself, grieving the illusion that harmony required her silence. And as she lets these illusions go, she cries not from sadness, but from relief, from the release of carrying emotional weight that was never hers, from the freedom of finally stepping into the truth that she alone is responsible for her inner world. And as this truth settles into her bones, she feels something extraordinary awakening within her, a sense of internal authority, a knowing that she is allowed to take up space emotionally, that she is allowed to feel without justification, that she is allowed to walk away from what destabilizes her, that she is allowed to choose herself, even when others don't. And this internal authority shifts everything. She no longer clings, she chooses. She no longer reacts, she responds. She no longer chases, she aligns. She no longer collapses, she recalibrates. She no longer tolerates, she discerns. She no longer suppresses, she expresses. And the more she embodies this, the more magnetic she becomes. Not the performative magnetism of trying to be desirable, but the quiet magnetic force of a woman who knows her worth and refuses to abandon herself. And this magnetism begins to repel what is not aligned and draw in what is like a tuning fork vibrating at her own frequency for the first time. And though she is still adjusting to this new way of being, she begins to realize something life-altering. A woman who owns her emotional world becomes untouchable, not because she is cold, but because she is anchored. Not because she is detached, but because she is self-led. Not because she has walls, but because she has boundaries. And this anchoring prepares her for the next chapter of her awakening, the chapter where she reclaims something. She never knew she lost the return of her inner feminine. Not the softened, silenced, over-accommodating feminine she performed for approval, but the true feminine, intuitive, sovereign, magnetic, embodied alive, the feminine self who rises when a woman no longer lives from fear. The return of the inner feminine. There comes a moment in every woman's awakening when emotional sovereignty creates enough space inside her for something beautiful, ancient and long forgotten to rise, the return of her inner feminine. Not the version she performed to be accepted, nor the version she diluted to stay safe, nor the version she distorted to be chosen, but the original feminine essence she carried before the world taught her to shrink the feminine energy that is intuitive, receptive, embodied, magnetic, creative fluid, powerful in ways that require no force. And as this inner feminine begins to surface, it does not arrive with fanfare or noise, but with a soft yet undeniable presence. Like the warmth of sunlight touching her skin after standing in shadow for years, and at first she almost mistakes this warmth for weakness, because she spent so long equating strength with control, independence with rigidity, boundaries with hardness. But the more she allows herself to feel this feminine energy, the more she realizes that softness is not the opposite of strength. Softness is strength, intuition is intelligence, receptivity is wisdom, vulnerability is courage, and her feminine nature is not something to fix or manage. It is something to return to, something she abandoned only because she had no inner safety to hold it. And now that she has rebuilt that safety through sovereignty and shadow integration, her feminine essence has finally come home. And this homecoming shifts everything inside her in ways that are profound yet subtle. Her breath becomes deeper, her movements slower but more intentional, her presence softer but more grounded, her emotions clearer, her body more alive, her mind less frantic, her energy more magnetic. and she begins to experience herself not as a collection of wounds and survival strategies, but as a coherent, embodied woman. A woman who no longer fears her depth because she no longer fears herself. And with this embodied feminine presence comes the awakening of her intuition, the inner knowing. She silenced for years because others dismissed it, mocked it, invalidated it, or feared it. And now that this intuition returns, it does so with a clarity that startles her. A clarity that speaks in sensations and gut feelings, in subtle whispers beneath thought. A clarity that tells her the truth long before her mind catches up. And she begins to trust this inner knowing, not because it is always comfortable, but because it is always honest, and this honesty becomes a compass, guiding her through the spaces she once wandered blind. And the more she trusts it, the more she feels life unfolding in ways that feel aligned rather than forced fluid, rather than chaotic, guided rather than grasped. And she realizes that the feminine does not move by striving. She moves by sensing, by allowing, by responding, by flowing toward what feels expansive and away from what feels constricting. And this flow is not passivity, it is precision. The precision of a woman who is so attuned to herself that she no longer wastes energy chasing what is not meant for her or tolerating what disrupts her inner peace. And as she allows this feminine flow to lead her, she notices something extraordinary. She begins to attract experiences, opportunities, and relationships that mirror her new sense of self. Not because she is trying to manifest them, but because magnetism is the natural byproduct of authenticity, and her authenticity is no longer fractured or negotiated. It is whole, steady, radiant, and this radiance is not for others, it is for her. The glow of a woman who is finally in her own body, finally in her own spirit, finally in her own truth. And with this radiance comes an awakening of desire, not the performative desire she once shaped around others' needs, but her true desires, the desire for depth, for emotional reciprocity, for connection that does not require her to shrink, for pleasure that is not tied to validation, for love that honors her wholeness, for a life that feels like a home rather than a performance. And for a moment she feels afraid of these desires because she has been taught that wanting too much makes her ungrateful or unrealistic. But her feminine essence whispers, "Your desires are not too much. They are your directions," and she begins to let these desires lead her inward, revealing the life she is meant to create, the relationships she is meant to choose, the boundaries she is meant to uphold. And as she reconnects with her inner feminine, she also reconnects with the softness she once erased to survive, a softness that is not weakness, but wisdom. A softness that allows her to feel deeply without drowning, to love fully, without losing herself to remain open, without being unprotected. And this integration of softness and strength becomes her emotional signature, the new frequency she carries into the world, a frequency that tells others that she is no longer a woman who abandons herself, no longer a woman who pleads for love, no longer a woman who trades authenticity for belonging, but a woman who belongs to herself first. And because she belongs to herself, she becomes unshakable. And this unshakability does not harden her, it frees her to be expressive, sensual, intuitive, playful, fierce, wise, mysterious, creative, and deeply present in her life. And this presence becomes a sanctuary, a place within her she can return to any time the world becomes loud, a place that holds her through uncertainty because she has finally become the source of her own stability. And as she stands in this embodied feminine presence, she notices another profound shift. She stops overfunctioning emotionally in relationships, stops performing strength to appear low maintenance, stops over-explaining her feelings, stops choosing partners who need her to shrink, stops engaging with dynamics that drain her energy, stops mistaking turbulence for passion, stops accepting potential over reality. And in this release, she experiences a peace. She has never known the peace of no longer negotiating her worth, no longer chasing external validation, no longer molding herself to fit anyone's expectations. And as she embraces this peace, she realizes something fundamental. The woman she is becoming is not the woman she was taught to be. She is the woman she always was beneath the layers of conditioning. The woman who trusts herself, who hears her own truth, who honors her intuition, who protects her boundaries, who embodies her feminine essence without fear. And the woman she is becoming is the woman who will rise in the next chapter, not by force, not by performance, but by integrating everything she has reclaimed and stepping fully into her wholeness, her sovereignty, and herself. becoming the woman she was always meant to be. There comes a moment in every woman's awakening when all the parts she has reclaimed her worthiness, her shadow, her sovereignty, her intuition, her feminine essence begin to weave together, not as fragments of a life she is trying to repair, but as threads of a woman she is finally ready to become. And this weaving is not dramatic, not loud, not something the world immediately notices, but she feels it inside her like a shift in gravity. A new center forming a center that does not depend on validation, affection, or external certainty. And as this center strengthens, she realizes something she had never understood before. She has spent most of her life trying to become the woman others needed, expected, praised, tolerated, or shaped, but she had never been given space to become the woman she needed. And now, for the first time, that space belongs entirely to her. And as she breathes into this space, she feels a profound sense of homecoming in her body. Not the homecoming of returning to the past, but the homecoming of returning to herself. The self she abandoned before she even knew what self-abandonment was. And this realization brings her to tears, not out of sadness, but out of recognition. The recognition that she is no longer lost, no longer wandering through relationships or situations, trying to find herself in other people's reflections because she no longer seeks her identity in anyone's approval or rejection. She carries it inside her, now unwavering, clear-grounded, and as this inner identity solidifies, she begins to see how her entire life shifts around her. Not because she is trying to change external circumstances, but because internal clarity naturally reorganizes the world she chooses to participate in. And she starts noticing that the situations, relationships, and dynamics that once consumed her emotionally no longer grip her in the same way because she now sees them from a higher vantage point. A vantage point where her intuition speaks louder than her fear, where her boundaries speak louder than her longing, where her self-trust speaks louder than the echoes of her past. And in this new clarity, she feels something that once seemed impossible. Peace with herself, peace with her choices, peace with her journey, peace with the mistakes that once haunted her, peace with the relationships that ended, peace with the versions of her that loved without being loved back, peace with the years she spent trying to be enough, and this peace becomes her power, a power that does not need to be defended or proven, because it radiates from within. And with this radiance, she begins to understand the deeper truth of wholeness. Being whole does not mean being perfect, it means being integrated, being honest, being aligned, being responsible for her own energy. And she realizes that wholeness is not something she becomes, but something she returns to, a remembering of who she was before the world taught her to question herself. And as she sits in this remembering, she feels her future expanding, not as a plan or a timeline, but as a field of possibility. And she begins to sense what kind of woman she is becoming. A woman who does not negotiate her worth, a woman who knows when to walk away, a woman who chooses relationships that match her emotional maturity, a woman who no longer entertains potential at the cost of her peace, a woman who speaks her truth without rehearsing it, a woman whose standards come from self-respect rather than fear of abandonment, a woman whose softness is no longer a liability but a strength, a woman who loves deeply but never loses herself in love again, a woman whose intuition leads her more than her wounds, a woman whose presence feels like a boundary and an invitation at the same time. And as she steps into this identity, she feels her past selves gathering around her, the girl who longed to be seen. The woman who loved too hard, the version of her who stayed too long, the self who operated from fear, the shadow who protected her in silence, and she embraces each one of them, thanking them for surviving long enough for her to reach this moment, because she finally understands that they were not failures. They were foundations, and every wound they carried became a doorway to the woman she has become. And in this recognition, she begins to forgive herself in ways she did not know were possible. Forgiving herself for ignoring red flags, forgiving herself for giving love to those who could not hold it, forgiving herself for abandoning her intuition, forgiving herself for betraying her boundaries, forgiving herself for shrinking to fit someone's comfort, forgiving herself for every moment. She stayed silent when she should have spoken, forgiving herself not because she was wrong, but because she was learning. And this self-forgiveness becomes the final thread that completes the weave of her individuation the moment she steps fully into herself without apology or hesitation. And in this stepping, she feels a new kind of confidence, quiet, embodied, unshakable. Not the confidence of performing strength, but the confidence of being rooted in truth. And this rootedness changes the way she moves through the world. She walks differently with her shoulders relaxed and her chest open. She speaks differently with a calm clarity that does not waver. She chooses differently with discernment instead of desperation. She loves differently with depth but not self-erasure. She dreams differently without fear of being too much, and she finally understands that her life is no longer something that happens to her. It is something she co-creates with her inner self. And this realization becomes the quiet climax of her journey, not a dramatic transformation, but a profound alignment. The alignment of her inner world with her outer reality. And in this alignment, she becomes a woman who cannot be manipulated, a woman who cannot be underestimated, a woman who cannot be controlled through fear or guilt, a woman whose self-worth is not situational but sovereign. And as she stands in the center of her being, breathing deeply fully, present, fully awake, she realizes the truth she has been moving toward all along. She is not becoming someone new. She is becoming the woman she always was before the world convinced her otherwise, and now finally she is ready for the final chapter of her awakening. The chapter where she rises not as a wounded woman searching for herself, but as a whole woman who knows she is her own home. She rises without running. There comes a moment in a woman's journey after the breaking, after the remembering, after the descent into loneliness, after removing the mask, after reclaiming her shadow, after becoming emotionally sovereign, after returning to her feminine essence, after rising into the woman she was always meant to be, when everything inside her becomes still. Not the stillness of suppression or numbness, but the stillness of alignment, the stillness of truth, the stillness of a woman who no longer needs to run toward or away from anything. A woman who belongs to herself so completely that the world can no longer pull her out of her center. And in this stillness, she realizes that the entire journey she walked, the pain, the grief, the awakening, the shedding, the returning was never about becoming stronger for the sake of resilience alone. It was about becoming whole enough to stand in her softness without fear, whole enough to hold boundaries without guilt, whole enough to desire without shame, whole enough to love without losing herself, whole enough to choose solitude without seeing it as punishment, whole enough to walk away without collapsing. And as she stands in this new expression of herself, she feels something extraordinary awakening inside her, something she once believed only other women possessed, an inner quiet confidence. The kind that does not need to be spoken to be felt, the kind that settles into her bones like warm light, the kind that draws some people closer and gently repels others, the kind that comes not from what she has achieved, but from who she has become. And this becoming feels both ancient and new, as if she is stepping into a lineage of women who reclaimed themselves before her, a lineage of women who learned how to rise without running, how to trust without clinging, how to express desire without apology, how to refuse what diminishes them, how to choose what aligns with their soul. And she realizes she is now part of that lineage. Not because she is fearless, but because she is honest. Not because she is perfect, but because she is integrated. Not because she is invulnerable, but because she no longer betrays herself in the name of love. And this realization fills her with a deep emotional exhale, a release of every weight she carried, thinking she had to earn her place in the world, thinking she had to mold herself into the shape others preferred, thinking she had to prove her worthiness, thinking she had to be chosen to matter. And now that she has returned to herself, she sees how unnecessary all of that was, because the woman she is now would never hand her worth to anyone to evaluate. And as she stands at the edge of this truth, she looks back at the versions of herself who survived on hope alone, the girl who tolerated inconsistency because she believed that crumbs were better than starvation, the woman who watered dead relationships with the devotion she should have given herself, the self who silenced her intuition to preserve illusions, the heart that loved people who did not know how to receive her. And instead of judging those versions, she honors them because they carried her through the darkest hallways of her life, through the confusion, through the longing, through the self-abandonment, through the aching desire to be seen. And without their endurance, she would not be here standing in the light of the woman she has finally become. And in that gratitude, she finds forgiveness. Not the kind that excuses what hurt her, but the kind that frees her from the emotional residue of her past, the forgiveness that allows her to look at everything she lost as lessons rather than punishments, as catalysts rather than failures, as stepping stones rather than setbacks. And this forgiveness softens her heart in a way she once feared because she believed softness made her breakable. But now she understands that softness is what allows her to stay open, to stay alive, to feel beauty, to feel connection, to feel the world without armoring herself against it. And this soft yet steady heart becomes her compass, guiding her not through fear or desperation, but through authenticity. And with this authenticity, she begins choosing differently, choosing rest over proving, choosing clarity over chaos, choosing alignment over attachment, choosing truth over tolerance, choosing connection over compliance, choosing presence over performance, choosing herself over the fear of being alone. And these choices, once terrifying, now feel like liberation because she finally understands something. She was never taught a woman's power does not come from being needed, it comes from being herself. And as she embodies this truth, she becomes a woman who no longer lives in reaction to the world, but in relationship with it. A woman who moves through life with an elegance that comes from inner grounding. A woman whose yes is wholehearted and whose no is unshakable. A woman who knows that love is not something she begs for, but something she invites, and she invites it not through sacrifice, but through self-respect, through emotional maturity, through alignment with her truth. And as she steps fully into this new way of being, she notices that life meets her differently, not because it is suddenly easier, but because she now moves through it as a woman who knows she is her own home. And this knowing changes everything. It changes the way she speaks, the way she touches, the way she listens, the way she dreams, the way she loves, the way she walks into a room, the way she leaves what no longer serves her, the way she honors what does, and with each step she takes, she feels the deep, rhythmic pulse of herself, guiding her, reminding her that she no longer has to run from herself or toward anyone else to feel whole, because wholeness is not something she finds outside. It is something she carries inside, something she builds each time she chooses truth over fear, each time she honors her boundaries, each time she listens to her intuition, each time she refuses to collapse for love, each time she stays with herself in discomfort. And as this realization settles, she understands the final revelation of her journey. A woman rises not when she becomes hardened by the world, but when she becomes connected to herself, anchored in herself, aligned with herself. And as she feels this connection deep in her bones, she smiles, not the practiced smile she once used to keep the peace, but a real smile, a quiet smile. The smile of a woman who finally remembers who she is. And as she breathes into this new beginning, she steps forward, not running, not chasing, not searching, but rising without fear, rising without apology, rising without abandoning herself, rising as the woman she was always meant to become. And in that rise, she realizes she will never go back to the woman she had to be in order to survive, because she has now become the woman who knows how to live.